All right, everybody. Thank you so much to everybody for joining this session today. Thanks for those who are here with us in person. Thanks to all of those who are joining us online for this session on food sovereignty and alternative protein. And for those who've heard me moderate while at the COP, you've heard me say we have a great panel today. And I'm going to say it again, and it's because I'm so lucky to have a great panel every time I'm moderating. So I'm very happy to have two people in person here today and two people online. I'm just going to introduce who we have with us today, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about this session today. So I'm going to start with Simone, who is online. You can see her in the top right corner here, and for those online, should be able to see her as well. So Simone Lovera is the Executive Director of the Global Forest Coalition. She's a recipient of the 2018 Sandro Urashatse Award for a lifelong contribution to the defense of the world's forest and people. Global Forest Coalition is a worldwide coalition, 93 NGOs and indigenous peoples organizations from more than 60 countries striving for the rights-based, socially just forest conservation policies. Welcome, Simone. Also online, we have Ajay Jafar. Ajay is a citrus farmer based in the village of Margaj, Buhar, Punjab, India. He's the chairman of, sorry, I think, can you hear me here? Let's see if this works better. So Ajay is the chairman of the Bharat Krishnak Samaj, the Farmers Forum India. It's a non-political, non-sectarian association of farmers advocating for farmer prosperity. He's the editor of the Farmers Forum and Krishak Samachar, agriculture magazines focusing on increasing stakeholder awareness. He's also the member of various agricultural organizations closely associated with the cooperative movement. What it doesn't say here is also Ajay was very instrumental in the UN Food System Summit that took place last year. Welcome, Ajay. And joining us in person on the stage today, we have two esteemed guests as well. Right to my left, we have Mariana Bernal. She's a policy analyst at the Good Food Institute, Brazil. She works directly with government agents and public policymakers to foster communication between the government and market agents and collaborate with local, global, and multilateral players to ensure that the current regulatory framework allows for the full deployment of Brazil's alternative protein sector. Great to have you, Milena. Bem-vindo. And to my furthest left, we have Jennifer Stojkovic. She is the executive director of San Francisco City, a nonprofit organization that lobbies for public policies on behalf of the San Francisco business. She's also the author of the book called The Future of Food is Female, that I'm sure most of you is familiar with. It is about reinventing the food system to save the planet. She's also the founder of Vegan Women Summit, that I'm also sure many of you have heard about. Welcome, Jennifer, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, so we have a very interesting session today. We're going to be talking about alternative protein and food sovereignty. And why is that? Well, when we organized this event, we wanted to address some of the constraints and even tensions we're seeing between those two parts. And some of them are real, some of them are might be in the narrative setting. And we wanted to take this opportunity to publicly hash out some of the things. Essentially, we asked ourselves this question: can we have a dramatic increase of alternative protein in the coming years in a way that is aligned with food sovereignty? So in a way that actually addresses the rights of the workers, addresses the rights of the farmers, speaks to the big issues of ensuring that there is access to food production and access to nutritious food production as well. In the past, there has been some differences between the two. Often you hear, and I'm generalizing here, often you hear proponents of food sovereignty is making the claim that some of the tendencies we're seeing within alternative protein now is a continuation of corporate domination of the market, in which the same company, the same owners of the biggest food production systems in the world is now taking over the alternative protein market as well. Some would say it's also a continuation of the food colonialism in many ways. On the other hand, you have often proponents of alternative protein who think we don't have time to dig too much into some of the deeper underlying issues of shifting the food system, but that we need to move quickly because we are running out of time from a perspective of climate change, from a perspective of equitable food distribution, water use, animal suffering, and so forth. So one thing it's clear is that alternative protein is on the march forward. There's a massive market and it's growing year by year by year, which Milena and Jennifer can talk much more about than we can. But how do we ensure that this remains, and this takes a turn to ensure that it also addresses the rights of the farmers and those who produce our food, the chains, the commodity markets and everything else? How do we ensure that they can coexist in a way that makes alternative protein into something that supports a shift to a more equitable food distribution and supports equitable consumption across the planet, as opposed to becoming yet another specific commodity market for those who have the most? So we hope that today we can address some of those issues. There might be some contentious conversations. There might be some provocative encounters here. And we don't have any aspirations of walking out of this room and having shaken hands and have find a complete solution moving forward. But we think this is a crucial conversation that needs to go forward. And it is crucial, particularly in light of the increased uptake on the focus of food within the COPs. And most of you will know that the next COP, COP28, will take place in the UAE, which is one of the biggest investors in alternative protein. So from that perspective, it is also important to ensure that that direction, those investments are aligned with equitable food distribution and food sovereignty. So I will leave it at that. That's just kind of like a rough introduction to the whole thing. What's going to happen now is that each of the panelists is going to give a couple of minutes opening remarks. After that, we'll have a discussion. Then we will come to questions for those in the room, maybe some online questions as well. And then we'll have closing remarks from the panelists. So as before, I would like to start with those who are online, which would be Simone and Ajay. So Simone, would you like to give us your opening remarks, please?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for organizing this very interesting event. I hope you can hear me well. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you in person, but take it positively, it saves some carbon emissions that I didn't fly over. And there will be several people of the Global Forest Coalition at the summit. So please, if you want to link up with my colleagues in person, please try to look them up. They're often on the schedules. I'll try to take a little bit, I think it's a very interesting question, but I'll try to take a little bit a nuanced stance, because the Global Forest Coalition, which is really a coalition of indigenous peoples organizations, women's groups, and NGOs itself, tries to work with many, many different social movements. And we feel it's important to explore the links between those different movements and to respect and try to understand and mutually reinforce each other's aspirations and demands. One essential dimension that I would really like to highlight in the overall discussion that is often overlooked in the whole sustainability of the livestock production, really from a climate, nutritional, health, land grabbing, gender, environment and forest perspective, is the dimension of quantity. And of course, that's at the heart of 50 by 40, which is why it's such a strategic movement, actually. The negative impacts of livestock production are primarily associated with the quantity of production. Of course, there can be some improvements in terms of emission intensity, health, or environment, but they tend to be relatively marginal and easily outpaced by an increase of numbers of livestock. And that's especially true for forest and biodiversity impacts. Grazers are part of most natural ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, and they can actually contribute significantly also to the health of forest ecosystems, but only in balanced number. And you very often see if, there's too many grazers, including too many livestock in forest areas, things get out of balance. This is actually also a very important dimension that's too often overlooked for integrated agroecological systems and pastoral systems. They have a great potential, but only if the number of livestock is kept relatively low and in balance with the ecosystem that supports the productive system. Moreover, the the relationship between the number of animals and greenhouse gas emissions is often linear, even in these systems. Having that said, due to protein waste, plant-based food tends to be far more efficient than meat and dairy. So the relative impact of plant-based food is, per definition, always lower. But plant-based food can definitely be very unsustainable as well. And I very much, take the opening remarks actually at my heart, and I will not duplicate them, but I think that's a very good way to sketch the basic dilemma. Of course, look at the main sponsor of COP27. One of the main sponsors is Coca-Cola. You can hardly claim that that is a sustainable, part of the food system, but it is formally plant-based. And if a Mac plant is being served by someone who is seriously underpaid, in my view, it has quite a bitter taste. So the suggestion that plant-based food would be per definition sustainable is, of course, not founded. We need to embrace a system approach. We definitely need to change, the underlying problems of our food system, of our broken food system, which are very much in the corporate capture of food systems, which is all, driven for profit, and that has triggered a highly inequitable division of food, causing hunger, malnutrition on the one side, and obesity on the other side, as well as serious human rights violations and environmental disasters. I would just like to highlight the example of genetically modified soy, having spent 20 years of my life in Paraguay, because that's an often used alternative for meat, including very much in the southern South American countries themselves. But it causes significant environmental harm due to deforestation and the heavy package of agrochemicals the soy is manipulated to withstand, as well as very serious health impacts, especially for rural women, including increased breast cancer, malformation of newborns, and glaucoma. It also causes land concentration because it's that kind of crop that provides very little labor per hectare of land, and land grabbing especially causing amongst women, indigenous peoples, and other people having less secure tenure rights. This then also has very significant impacts on food sovereignty. You could see that very well in Paraguay, where now a lot of the daily food is being imported, often in a very unhealthy industrial system, while a lot of the original food production has actually been lost. And most of the land, 3/5 of the country, is now being used for genetically modified soy production in terms of agricultural land. So genetically modified soy is a very good example of a plant-based food that is genuinely unsustainable and part of a corporate-driven system that undermines food sovereignty. And other alternatives, plant-based alternatives, could go the same way. And there's already environmental problems associated with large-scale production of quinoa, of avocado, and even algae could go the same way. So it's really the systems that need to be challenged, and not just what you produce. Having that said, as if these crops are used for feedstock for livestock, the effects are accumulated, because using crops that can be directly used for human consumption as feedstock is a major form of food waste, and it really should be recognized like that this kind of protein waste we cannot afford anymore. Lastly, and then I will close, it's just important to mention the dimension of animal welfare, animal rights, and speciesism. Of course, here the shift to plant-based food is relatively more important than the shift to non-industrialized systems, although industrialized systems tend to be far more cruel than non-industrialized systems. But there is a need for the movements working on agroecology and integrated sustainable food systems to think more carefully about the concept of speciesism and to what extent human beings do have the right to simply use other species for their benefit, especially if those other species might suffer from pain. So in conclusion, what we need is really coherent system based on the realization that quantity is one of the primary factors in the unsustainability of food systems. In Latin America, there's a very important slogan: the people united will never be defeated. There's a great opportunity, I believe, for a broad alliance of social movements fighting for a more sustainable food system, but this will only work if those movements themselves truly respect and embrace each other's concerns and priorities. So people and movements primarily concerned about the rights of animals and perhaps the environment have to respect and embrace the concerns and priorities of peasant movements, indigenous peoples movements, including pastoralists, women's movements, workers' movements, and other social movements that strive for genuine transformative change in food systems. And at the same time, those social movements have to respect and embrace the concerns of people in movement who genuinely believe that the human species does not necessarily have the right to abuse other species. In any case, we stand ready as Global Force Coalition to work with all these different movements and to embrace their and respect their concerns. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Simone. Very powerful words there. I've actually changed my mind in terms of there's a sequencing of who speaks. I think it would be interesting now to hear from one of the two panelists here who will do the opening remarks, but also maybe address some of the questions or the issues that Simone brought up, and then come over to Ajay afterwards. So we get a little bit of mix in between. So maybe Jennifer, would you like to come in here?
Throw me in there. So, hi, everybody. Some of you were in the last panel I was in, so I apologize if you're seeing the same face for many hours, but this is a topic that I discuss quite a bit. In particular, my book, The Future of Food is Female. I spent a year and a half speaking to women changing the food system across 6 continents for the book. And it was really important to me to understand what are the effects of the industrialized food system all across the world, not just in North America where I live. And to add to Simone's remarks, which she so eloquently listed a tremendous amount of information around industrialized animal agriculture and how it affects the ecosystems in which it's proliferating. So, you know, about 90% of the meat that's produced in the world is produced in industrialized animal agriculture standards. In the US, it's 99%, and in Canada as well. So when we talk about the meat industry, you know, that is what we are discussing, right? That is what meat de facto is produced like all across the world. And one of the aspects that is often left entirely out of the conversation is the human rights side of it. We touched on this a little bit in the last conversation that I was in, but it is terrible the way that these systems absolutely target the most underserved communities in both the United States and beyond for where they are scaling their production. It is hidden behind so many dark shadows as to how these products are produced. So there was a documentary that just came out, The Smell of Money, and it's the first time ever in history that a class action lawsuit made it all the way to the Superior Court in the US against Smithfield Farms for what they were doing to the rural Black communities in North Carolina, which were essentially victims of the climate catastrophe, of poisoning the water system, of the immense amount of various different air pollutants that were causing upticks in cancer, respiratory illnesses. These people are completely forgotten from the conversation because they are hidden away by intention. The most deregulated states in the United States in particular are the ones that are most likely to have factory farming conditions. And these are the types of conversations that completely get left out. And so looking at the effect on human rights, then we look at the fact that where slaughterhouses are located in the US, a study from Yale of over 170 different communities with slaughterhouses found there's a significant increase in domestic violence and violent crimes when these are placed in these communities. So we have data that shows that there are true psychological effects to people working in these conditions. This is on top of the fact that Oxfam produced an amazing report a few years ago, right before the pandemic, on chicken production that some folks here might be aware of. They found that on average, a person is maimed, killed, or debilitated every 3 days in a meat processing plant in the United States. Like, it is completely normal at Tyson Foods for people to lose fingers every few days. And these are the standards in which meat is being produced. And this oligopoly we see in the United States is not just in the US, it goes beyond to other parts of the world as well, where a large concentration of meat is produced by a number of meat producers that control the large part of the entire food ecosystem. And it's happening in other parts of the world, including in the global south, including in places like Mexico, for instance, that are now reaching, the highest rates of obesity. Countries that did not traditionally have large meat and dairy consumption are now seeing the effects of it. So when we talk about alternative proteins and the types of opportunities that we can build here, we need to understand that the system that we are up against, it's not working for anyone. It doesn't work for climate. It doesn't work for personal health, certainly doesn't work for public health. We're in the biggest avian flu pandemic of all time right now. 77 million birds have been culled, which could lead to some real issues of antibiotic resistance. And it doesn't work for animals. And lastly, it doesn't work for human beings and their rights. So those are the aspects that I think are important to take a look at when we look at the opportunity of what alternative protein poses. And so when we think about where these products are going to be located and how we can create these from a local focus, I think that's where it comes into the entrepreneurship conversation, right? We say alternative protein, but in fact, these proteins are rich in history. Many diets all around the world, the majority of diets, did not have large meat consumption. And so plant-based proteins have a deep, rich history in most cultures around the world. And how do we refine that and help these farmers that are currently, being forced into these massive conglomerate contracts where they have to produce GMO soy, which 80% of that GMO soy goes towards animal feed, not human consumption, right? Like only a very small portion of that GMO soy makes it into plant-based meats. I think that's a very important thing that we need to look at when we talk about the effects that these crops have. So I guess to end those remarks, we need to think about what are the solutions that we can build in the communities which are affected by the industrialized animal agriculture system, and how do we shift away from that in a way that is both honoring these communities so that they can contribute and be a part of owning the food systems they're a part of, but also acknowledging the fact that the way that meat is currently produced is completely and utterly destroying all of our communities in every way. I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's a great perspective and a very sobering facts as well, and horrifying facts, really. I would like to come now to Ajay. Ajay, you're not only a farmer yourself, you also work with lots of farmers, cooperatives, and unions. And I'll be very curious to hear your thoughts on the aspects of food sovereignty and how you see alternative protein fitting into that.
Thank you for this opportunity, allowing me to participate in this event in an online mode. I really wonder those supporting sovereignty are doing it in an online format, and those supporting alternative proteins are physically present at COP27. Let me start off with those thoughts. The topic today of alternate proteins versus voices for food sovereignty. At the onset, I find this topic alters the narrative, and one is forced to presume that debate around alternate proteins is only limited to issues of food sovereignty. It is much more than that. We've got to understand that the world has correctly identified excess meat consumption as an existential crisis. But the public perception that is being molded is to show that all meat consumption is bad. And these are two different issues. There are many other issues that need to be factored in discussions like this. First of all, alternate protein products today are more expensive, have a high carbon footprint, do not fully substitute naturally occurring compounds, amino acids, and nutrition requirements of the body. It may reach acceptable levels sometime in the distant future, but even if it does that, it will be pumping in a lot of chemicals into the human body. And I think that needs to be factored into these discussions. On the very question of food sovereignty, we need to understand that markets tend to gravitate towards larger, more economically efficient businesses. Alternate protein fits into the perfect storm of consolidation of power, market share grab, and a few stakeholders having the power to control people's choices, people's eating habits, what consumers see on market shelves, what consumers buy, and its attendant issues. Control of market, specifically in the hands of a few in the food sector, is indirectly proportional to access to food for all, and it leads to food colonization. We must be mindful of the fact that animals are an integral part of agroecology principles and practices of a systems approach. I foresee a time, maybe it's already here, that alternate proteins will become applicable for carbon credits and receiving subsidies that are repurposed from smallholder farmers, and farmers who have cows and buffaloes and goats and sheep at home will get taxed for methane emission. So one shoe fits all is not going to work. We really need to differentiate between industrial farming systems and smallholder farmer production systems. And the issues can be summarized in the 4 points. 1, excess consumption of meat in the developed world is the issue. 2, industrial farming to meet the consumer's demand for animal proteins. Farmers not receiving fair value of food produced in sustainable ways leads them to adopt practices or continue practices which add to a carbon footprint of industrial farming. There is a conspiracy to project the food crisis as one where meat consumption is bad, while giving facts about industrial meat production being bad. There's a law, there are millions and billions of people, farmers on the fields who have animals on the farm and they're not doing industrial farming. That needs to be accounted for in these conversations. Rather than projecting alternate proteins as a solution, we should be prioritizing lesser meat consumption in developed nations and farmers receiving a higher value for their produce such that they can lead dignified livelihoods. These are the real issues. And that's what we must be looking at. We must be looking at consumption behavior as a solution. We must be looking at farmers getting better values as a solution. We must be looking at taxing industrial animal farming. And I would want to leave my thoughts at this point on this, and we'll come back in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajay. Very sobering thoughts here as well. Well, the plot thickens, doesn't it? So we heard a little bit from Simone about the importance of making the differentiation between industrialized farming and the smallholder pastoralist, and always talk about food sovereignty. And Jennifer talked a lot about the horrible conditions of the industrialized farming system as we're seeing it now. So that's very sobering to have a contrast to when we talk about decreasing meat consumption and some of the problems that might arise, that needs to be held in contrast to the current system, which is bad in every way. And then, of course, we heard from Ajay now, who's talking about the importance of really speaking to farmers, engaging farmers, but also your perspective, Ajay, is that not all meat is bad, that we need to make a differentiation between commodity produced or industrialized produced meat and smallholder farmers. So that brings me over to you, Milena. You're based in Brazil, a country that has one of the biggest meat export markets in the world, a huge domestic consumption, and has issues. At the same time, it is the biggest commodity market in the world. You're the biggest exporter of coffee, orange juice, soy, sugarcane, you have it. And at the same time, you have people starving in Brazil. So you work on alternative proteins. How do you see that all fitting together?
Thank you, Leslie. Hi, everyone. So at first, I just want to introduce you to GFI's theory of change, because I feel like it's great to set the stage at first. So we did lots of research to understand what drives consumers, to see what would make them change their habits. And consumers are actually looking for taste, price, accessibility, affordability, and health. So we already understand that for people to change the impact of their foods, they are not going to change unless the product change, because they're resistant to being changed, not to change. So at GFI, we're looking for types of technology that would deliver these kinds of products that people actually want to buy and want to eat. So we're looking for their culture, we're looking to preserve their environment, and we're doing this through alternative proteins, which is plant-based meat, dairy, eggs, cultivated meat, and products produced through fermentation. So this all to say that we've been talking about going vegan and vegetarian for ages, and so far we haven't reached a point where we can say that we're actually making progress. So I'll just leave it that thought with you, so we can discuss it a little bit over. And in Brazil especially, we're looking for how to make this shift even from a global south perspective, because in Brazil, most of our agribusiness now is moved and enriching by soy and cattle production. And as Jennifer said, the soy is mostly for feeding cattle, not for feeding humans. So we already understand also that the current food system producing protein, the way that we produce right now, is inefficient because we need 90 calories to produce 1 calorie of the most efficient meat product, that would be chicken. So how can we make more food with less resources that are scarce right now? So we're trying to bring this discussion into the global south, and especially in the Amazon and in Cerrado. GFI is promoting research on how we can explore these kinds of products and ingredients and local ingredients that can promote communities there and promote local sustainable development without changing the way people eat and feed themselves. So I'll leave it like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Milena. Thanks for that perspective, and particularly the perspective from Brazil, which I think is very important given the conundrum of the commodity market versus feeding the people. So it seems to me that there is everybody agrees that we need to shift the current food system. That is one. Secondly, everybody agrees that we need to respect people, we need to respect nature and respect animals and find a good way forward. But still, I feel, not necessarily in this panel, but overall, there seems to be some kind of bad blood or animosity between those two sectors, also given some of the comments now. So I wanted to ask now, maybe Simone or Ajay, if you look at alternative protein and the role that can play in shifting the food system to a more equitable and sustainable food system, what would that entail? And I wanted to build a little bit on that question. So in alternative protein, we've been going through the last 10, maybe 15 years an R&D phase. And now the market is quite established and still exploding, but maybe the market is going to start to diversify a lot. So we're going to have more products that are like very sustainable, ecological, based on agroecology and so forth. I mean, I think we need to recognize it's a very new market compared to the established food market. So from your perspective, Simone and Ajay, would there be a situation in which you think alternative protein could have a very positive role? And what would that entail? Would that be a differentiation between GMO soy as input for the alternative proteins, or shifting to, let's say, using pea protein that is based on agroecology, locally sourced? So what would it take for you to see alternative protein as something that could play alongside your values on sustainability, food sovereignty, and social justice? Maybe you first, Simone.
Yeah, I actually was just thinking I would be really curious to hear Ajay's perspective on this. You know, as a producer himself, but I was quite fascinated also for this. Well, let me first respond to your question. I mean, I'm always a little bit surprised by this expression alternative proteins, as if, you know, this is a new alternative. And, you know, of course, it's being presented like that by what is more and more becoming a highly commercial sector, very industrialized as well. And as I said, yeah, some of that sector is more and more having, you know, a negative impact on the planet as well. But, you know, plant-based proteins have always been part of diets. I think Jennifer very clearly said that also. Historically, loads of, you know, peoples all over the world have been eating beans, have been eating soybeans also, but then non-genetically modified soybeans, and have been adding all kinds of alternative proteins to their diets. And those don't necessarily have to be very expensive. I mean, especially beans tend to be relatively cheap alternatives, which are happily affordable. And let's be serious, I mean, prices are an issue nowadays. We can't disconnect ourselves from the real world, where so many billions of people at this moment are facing a very serious food crisis, and food price crisis especially. And there was actually a little bit, you know, it's often said that smallholder, that was my question to AJ, I mean, that smallholder farmers need to earn a dignified living from their production. But yeah, to what extent is that realistic in the current food system, in the current commercial market-based food systems? Because consumers will always want to opt for low food prices. And I think we shouldn't forget all those consumers that actually don't have a choice, you know, and especially women women with sort of from poor incomes classes, they very often don't have the option to go for a more expensive produce. They tend to be the main victim of higher food prices because they traditionally in many cultures still have the obligation to provide for a good meal for their family, no matter whether they have the money to pay for it or not. So especially in the current situation, you very much see them becoming the victim of these high food prices. Having that said, I mean, the current high food prices are, of course, very much, the result of international speculation, of, a couple of countries really benefiting from, what was originally already a very imperialist war and subsequently a big power game that is now making billions of people all over the world suffer. And the people that are the winners of the current situation are really, the big companies that are making all the money out of these high prices. So you just really see nowadays in 2022 how much this system is broken. And it's the entire system that is broken. And, the alternative protein market, as it is called, if it stays part of that system, it will be broken as well. We really need to change that system. We need to make sure that, women and men and other genders are able to provide for a good meal for their families without, having to pay too much. But at the same time, that farmers indeed are able to make a dignified living, from what they produce. And my question actually for AJ, so let me just add a question then to him, is, how do you see this realistically? I mean, a couple of things are obviously realistic. One is taxes for meat and dairy, industrialized meat and dairy. I mean, that's an obvious. Taking away perverse incentives, it's been, it's an official mandate already under the Convention on Biodiversity, and it has to be implemented by now because it's obscene. $500 billion every year is being spent on destroying the planet. We have to get rid of those subsidies. I mean, a lot of those subsidies go to industrial livestock systems and industrial agriculture systems in general. And you very much see, especially also in the European Union and the US, that, by far the biggest money goes to the biggest players. So it's such an inequitable system that it has to change, if we can't start talking. But above that, how do you see in the current market, how we can build more food sovereignty so that we indeed can have both, affordable meals and a dignified living for those who produce those meals.
Thanks a lot, Simone. And that's a great handover to Ajay. And in a second, I want to hear from Milena and Jennifer about what your thoughts are on what the two panelists are saying. So Ajay, over to you for a minute or so.
Okay, thank you for this. There is a place for alternate proteins in the world, and there's no doubt about it, but it needs to be regulated, it needs to be controlled, and it's not the final solution. Anyway, coming to the question that was asked is what we can do about, getting dignified livelihoods to smallholder farmers. I want to link this to the statement that you gave about research going into alternate proteins for the last decade or so. So let me give you an example. I was the vice chair of Action Track 2 on sustainable consumption at the UN Food System Summit. And I proposed to the chairs to include backyard poultry and kitchen gardens as a main approach. And I was asked to substantiate my suggestions with data, but that data was not widely available. FAO in its annual report stated that home gardening and production for home consumption are vastly undocumented, so the impact is largely unknown. Where is the money going in for research to find real solutions to help smallholder farmers become sustainable? Are we looking at food value chains which span the globe of globalization? Are we looking or focusing on closed food loops about community farming, about community markets, about wet community markets? So these are issues that need to be flagged. And just before I end, I want to add this point that sovereignty of food also includes freedom in agriculture and food and research. It's equally important. There is a concentration of power on how research is being conducted. 8 seed or biotech companies account for 76% of R&D spending. 5 companies account for 74% of agrochemical R&D. 4 companies performs 57% of farm machinery research and development. 8 companies accounted for 66% of R&D in animal health. And then we come up with the concept of one CGIAR, where one person, one family, one institution is going to be funding the CGI public research system. And they will control where research is going. So if research is going to come up with facts, which everyone is going to tout in every panel discussion at COP27, I think we are into great, great difficult times. I just want to leave it at there, but what I'm trying to emphasize is that research is biased today. We need to free research, agriculture research, food research from the hands of a few people, and public governments need to spend more on agriculture research for solutions, for real solutions to emerge. Otherwise, we'll keep coming up with solutions which are not solutions, which are just pushing the problems to the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajay. And just the process comment here, we're going to go for another 10 minutes, and then we're going to come over to questions from you guys. A lot of important points here from Simone and some interesting points. Maybe one outcome of this session is that we need independent research into how we address this together. But I wanted to come to you, Jennifer, and hear your thoughts on what's been said so far.
I got a bullet list I'm keeping in my head here, trying to keep up with everyone's very thoughtful and impactful remarks. Ajay, I agree in terms of the research that's currently being conducted in agriculture. We do need to look at where the sources are coming from, and the vast majority of the sources right now, certainly in the United States, are coming from the Meat and Dairy Association. One of the largest delegations that I've seen here is actually the US dairy farmers, right? So the vast majority of the information we're getting around nutrition and the food system is sourced from the animal agriculture industry, not from the alternative protein industry, right? So that's the first remark I wanted to make. The second one, in terms of the backyard farming, I think that one of the pieces that gets left out in this conversation from a socioeconomic standpoint is, particularly in urban communities, we don't have backyards. Like, there is so many, not just Americans, but people in the world that are growing up in apartments. We own the least amount of land we've ever owned, particularly in North America, because of the housing crisis. It is not a practical solution for people to just start growing meat and eggs in their backyard. And that's certainly, from a socioeconomic standpoint, those that are more likely to be people of color, to be concentrated in urban environments, certainly don't have any space for that. At a second side note to that, we actually have multiple different salmonella and E. coli outbreaks that have happened due to backyard farming in the US. And there's 2 different states that are looking to regulate and ban the sale of backyard eggs because of that, because there are no standards, right? The third point that I saw that was mentioned earlier, Ajay, I agree, the conglomerates that control our meat industry are a real concern, and alternative protein is a great opportunity for us to decentralize that control. So just to juxtapose this, right? There are 4 meat companies that control 99% of the production in just the US alone. In California, there are 40 alternative protein companies. That's only in California. That's one state of 50. Right? There are hundreds, possibly thousands of alternative protein companies all around the world. So we already are decentralizing the control of meat and protein production just by nature of how we're disrupting this industry. And the last thing that I just want to throw in there is, I do believe that there is a very real Luddite mentality and fear mongering around using chemicals in food. I believe that we have a tremendous amount of biased misinformation out there that is being used to scare people away from plant-based proteins and telling them they're filled with processed ingredients, they're filled with chemicals. But the simple reality is that there's a tremendous amount of chemicals and things that are used in production for meat. The only thing that's different is that we don't have to label the ingredients panel on a meat product, right? So if you look at wine and chicken breasts and things like that, they don't have to say what's in them, whereas we do have to say what's in them. And so I think that's caused a lot of fear mongering around people that see a long ingredient list and think, oh, it's scary, it's bad for me. That's not necessarily the case. Certainly there can be label cleanup done, but to go back to what I think is a really important point here is that the #1 selling meat in America is Tyson chicken nuggets. So the standard that we're at right now is a much worse standard. So alternative protein has a lot of potential to disrupt and create a healthier standard for meat in the homes of this country and beyond.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And as you're up against the It's interesting to make the differentiation between what is seen by some as some kind of evil, like the processed food, alternative protein, but then juxtaposing it against what we're up against now, which is much, much bigger evil, so to speak. And also, I think the point about the burden of proof in terms of the contents of alternative protein is a very relevant point. So Melina, I wanted to come to you now and also to hear your reflections on this, and also maybe to add something, just because I know in Brazil is such an interesting country in this sense, because most of the commodity market is for export, but most of the food that people eat on the ground in Brazil is from agricultura familiar, like family produce, so to speak. So the daily fruit and veg for most Brazilians comes from smallholders, whereas the big commodity market with meat and soy and so forth is owned by big corporations. So from that perspective, where do you think alternative protein would fit into that constellation? And would it be more in the agriculture familiar area or more like a commodity market? And which way would you like to push it?
I think you know the answer already, right, Lassie? But just coming back to one of the projects that we have that we are funding, Jeffy Brazil is funding research and development in the Amazon, because we've conducted research with alternative protein companies to understand most of their the challenges associated with the production chain. And we found out that they were actually struggling finding national products and ingredients. So they would be able to stop importing ingredients and also making the price more competitive for alternative proteins there. So by the result of this research, we developed this project, the Biome project, to incentivize researchers to go into the Amazonic biome and the Cerrado biome to find solutions for alternative proteins, which would actually localize more our ingredients and while securing communities' livelihoods there. So one of the criteria that we had for this project was how would they be applicable to the community's agenda and development there. And now we are funding over, I think, 6 researchers. Not sure. Hello? So the way we see it is that we need to localize the production so it's more affordable for people, and also it makes sense for the communities. And another project that we are now overseeing is the project with beans, Brazilian beans. So we have plenty of different species of beans in Brazil, so that it makes no sense that we are producing alternative proteins in Brazil made by peas or chickpeas or other species that we don't have locally. So this is all to say that we, from a Global South perspective, we have a way of including these people to this conversation and also improving their livelihoods while producing alternative proteins and not just cattle and soy for exportation.
Great, so thank you so much. I think it's so important to make those differentiations, and that's a good reply to how we can make alternative protein a bit more sustainable. I mean, I'm not suggesting it's unsustainable, but to make it even more sustainable is to look at what can you produce locally and then use that as input for the products. All right, so I have a long list of questions, both right here and also in my head. I would love to answer, to get answers to, but I also really want to hear from people in the room. If anybody's online, the people organizing, let me know if there's some online questions as well. I want to come to you now and take some questions from you for the panelists. And then for the panelists, in about 10 minutes, we're going to do a wrap up in which you get 2 minutes and 2 minutes only to just give them some closing remarks. And I would like you to focus on what are the key next steps we need to take to bridge that gap there is between those two different perspectives. So to the people in the room, any questions for the panelists? Sweta.
Hi, very interesting panel. Thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts. I have a question for both All Protein and FoodSoft. So to FoodSoft, I think my question is, I think Simone, you kind of said it really eloquently that it is an issue of scale. And I think my question is that even if we do promote food sovereignty, how are we going to get to a stage where we solve the problem of scale? Because it is like Jennifer shared, like 90%, 99% of production is industrial. So even if we do promote food sovereignty, it doesn't solve for like 90% of the issue. So that's the general question for like food sovereignty. For like alt protein, I think my question is that I think current studies, so far as I know, have shown, and I think they've been done in America, that there's an increase in alt protein consumption and there's an increase in general meat consumption, but there's no actual decrease overall in the amount of meat that is being consumed right now, as far as studies have shown. There is some shift in milk, but not so much in meat. And I think given that there's a very pro-industry stance that unfortunately like the alt meat industry is taking, how do we stop it from being turning into a pure profitable business and keeping, I think, the systems change at the heart of it versus it becoming like a purely profit-driven, market-driven mechanism in and of itself? I hope that's clear.
Thank you so much for that question. RJ, sorry, I didn't see you. Do you want to come in? We can't hear you, RJ. You're on mute.
I just want to answer this question by saying it's not about if food produced in meat produced in sustainable ways will meet the demand of the world. The question here is to change consumption habits of people in the developed world, and they eat less meat. That's what we should be targeting, a behavior change. That's the primary topic. We're not saying that you keep consuming so much more meat, maybe 50 times more than what is acceptable or what the developing world or the underdeveloped world is eating. And I also want to add that I agree with Jennifer that urban areas don't have backyards, so they can't have backyard poultry or kitchen gardens. But Jennifer, that's exactly the problem, because agriculture is non-sustainable for small farmers, and that's why small farmers from the developing world or in the developed world migrating to cities is the problem. And that's why cities are overpopulated today, because we are not able to make smallholder farmers profitable where they are in the villages, in rural areas. And so the crisis always goes back to providing a dignified livelihoods that people are not forced to migrate to urban areas. And the other topic I want to just answer, because this was earlier flagged, was repurposing of subsidies. It's not going to be enough, because America is going to be repurposing subsidies for American farmers. And likewise, Europe will repurpose their subsidies for European farmers. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's within political boundaries. It's their money to do it if they think like that. But the problem is that there are very few farmers in these countries with lots and lots of money that governments have. And most of the farmers who need to be supported live in the global south, where countries don't have money to support them. And in this COP27, especially that we are here and we're talking about climate change, let me just warn you, as a farmer from the global south, you can repurpose all your subsidies in Europe and America. Climate is going to impact you as much as it's going to impact us. So you've got to buckle up your act and think beyond. And this question, this is to all the developed world who's sitting everywhere, that if you don't look after farmers in small nations and small countries, we are going to be migrating across the Mediterranean, across the Mexican border, across the Atlantic. We're going to come into your homes. We're going to come into your countries. So I think it's better if you try and solve the problem where we are in the global south, rather than solve the problem by building walls around your houses and cities and having laws to fence off Mexico and fence off Central America. Think longer term, I think. Think 50 years, think 200 years from now. Don't think about what's going to happen in the next 5 years. Thank you.
Thanks, RJ. Important long-term perspective there. I see Jennifer wanted to come in.
Ajay, I think the climate refugee perspective is a very important one to bring up. And many people don't realize, like, even in the United States and California, where I live, we don't even have food sovereignty where we are, right? 20% of the state of California's water is used to grow alfalfa and pasture for cattle production. And of that 20%, the vast majority is sent to foreign countries to feed livestock production in other countries, right? So we are now currently facing water shortages, and there are water wars happening in the state of California, happening in the state of Arizona, in the poorest of communities in the Central Valley, where there is no voice for them because their water is being sold at a bottom dollar to create alfalfa to go 6,000 miles away to another country to produce more and more meat. So I think when we talk about food sovereignty, we need to talk about even the developed world is a victim of this. And we are going to have a mass amount of climate migration, even in the US. I was just speaking in Canada last week where they're talking about Canada becoming the next breadbasket of the world, right? There's only a few countries in the world where we have the capabilities to produce the level of plant protein needed for the growing population. It's really just China, Canada, potentially Brazil, and Ukraine and Russia were another big one. So from a geopolitical standpoint, it's very important too that we consider what are these capabilities of nations around the world as our borders and conflicts emerge.
Thank you so much. I wanted to see them all. I have three questions I think we can do. Please be brief and please present your name and affiliation. Can somebody help with the mic?
Hi, hello. Hi, I'm Nicole Pita, and I work at IPES Food, one of the co-leads of this pavilion. And I'm really excited that you planned this talk, Lasse. Thank you so much for doing so. You touched on so many issues that often come up relating to plant-based proteins, alternative proteins. But one that I didn't hear about yet is how many of these food items are actually highly processed foods. So if we're trying to actually solve for a public health crisis, like you've really pointed out in the United States is a huge issue, especially related to eating highly processed foods, how can alternative proteins as highly processed food contribute to solving that problem?
Thank you so much. I think my mics are working again now. So I'll take the two other questions. So we have them ready just to make sure there was the lady with the cover.
Hi, my name is Carolyn. I'm with the Good Food Institute. So obviously, have a lot of agreement with Mari, but I'm so appreciative of the diversity of conversation in this panel because one thing we talk about a lot is this is such a huge crisis and problem. This is like not an either or solution. This is like, to me, every single possible solution we can throw at it. But I would love to understand, if we do have the time, talking about behavior change and habits, that can obviously be a really lengthy process. So again, not to say that we shouldn't make those attempts, but speaking at least from the United States perspective, foods like, I was raised vegetarian. So I always joke like, why can't we all just eat chickpeas and lentils? That's all I've eaten my whole life. I'm good. Most people, unfortunately, either do not have that access, or if they do, they have no interest in eating in that way. So again, fully support the idea of better nutrition in schools and education and making produce more affordable. But given the urgency of the climate crisis and the little amount of time that we have, we can't wait for people to move. Most people don't have that option. Our government has a lot going on right now. We can't, to wait for them to create these subsidies. So I'm just curious, in terms of timing and treating this with the urgency that it needs. I'd love to hear thoughts, even if it is short-term. I agree we need long-term as well, but it's so urgent. So any short-term solutions with people who really won't eat a vegetable, who don't know what lentils are, how do we kind of think through that? Again, thinking in this as like a multiple solutions to the problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the final question in the back, and then I will close questions.
Okay, mine is for the food sovereignty conversation. By the way, I'm Naomi and I'm with 50 by 40. With respect to food sovereignty and us saying that it's a farmer's choice what they want to grow, but reports suggest, especially in the tropics, and I completely agree with you, Mr. Jocker, with respect to the global north consuming a lot of protein, and we don't in the global majority or in the south. But reports suggest that heat stress and basically erratic climate and drought will impact our food production quite drastically. And given that reality, and it's coming, why aren't we preparing, or what are we doing to prepare our farmers for that reality? Because if you look at Kenya now, I think since 2020, or I think 1.4 million farm animals have, more than that actually, have perished just due to drought. They're emaciated. And when they are selling these animals, they're not actually receiving the right price for these animals because it's a demand and supply thing. So when there's a drought, there's a lot of supply of animals. And normally it's believed that these animals are, they're drought insurance essentially. So how are we preparing farmers for this day? And animals eat a lot more than humans do. I know you might say that, there'll be food shortage for humans as well, but we eat less. That's my question.
Okay, thank you so much. So there's a question about, is alternative protein highly processed and unhealthy essentially? So there's a question about, well, if we don't have alternative protein, people are not going to shift away from meat because they are just so used to eating meat. And then about a question about building resilience and preparing to have a resilient food system, given the fact that animal protein production, generally speaking, is more resource intensive than vegetable production. So we're going to have like 1 minute each to just come back to respond to these questions. And Tom, Melina wanted to come in before on the question on the highly processed food, right? So over to you, Melina.
So this is an ongoing debate in Brazil right now. So we at GFI Brazil just conducted a research comparative study between animal products and alternative protein products, just to make sure that we were delivering what we are saying that we are. And the research actually shows that they are healthier just because they deliver less sodium, less saturated fat, more fiber to consumers. So if we are comparing the same product with their analogous and their counterparts from vegetable sources, you can actually have more benefits from one side than in the other. And as we said about arterial change, people are resisting being changed. So if we don't have enough research and development to improve the possibility of having food that tastes exactly the same as animals, you actually will have to improve their nutritional aspects in other ways.
Thank you so much, Melina. Jennifer, did you want to come in on any of these?
Sure, I'll just add to that. And then I'm really curious from Ajay's perspective about the farmers question. So I think the process debate is, first off, we know for a fact that that's been placed in the media by the meat industry. You can trace the facts. It's most of those articles come from the Center for Consumer Freedom. They're the ones that have been pushing the processed meat narrative for the last year and a half very heavily. And it's driven market perceptions to change, right? We lost 8 points on the average consumer believing that plant-based meats are healthier for you than their animal-based alternatives. But we do know the data says that they are nutritionally superior. Now, with that being said, the meat industry currently is disruptive from a climate perspective, from a public health and antibiotics perspective, from an animal welfare perspective, from a human rights perspective. And these plant-based proteins are addressing the vast majority of them. So whether or not your chicken nugget that's a vegan chicken nugget is drastically healthier than the chicken nugget equivalent, I think we're missing the point. Like, we are addressing so many key disastrous issues. Why are we getting hung up on one aspect of this product? There's always a new level where plant-based proteins are held up to a different standard, and it seems to increase every single year. Every time we make more gains, there's a new thing that we're not reaching. And so I think it's important that we contextualize we are a win in many different ways, and we'll continue to improve in the others.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I wanted to come over first to Ajay and also Simone on any questions or comments you might, any comments or answers you might have for particularly the question about resilience. Ajay, over to you.
I think it's a very difficult topic to address resilience. To address resilience or short-term solutions, I think so require work on twofold. One is farm advisory services on better farming practices. We need investment in that. If you look at the data of the last 5 years, even before the pandemic hit, the public funding for research in all of Global South is going down for agriculture research. Public funding for farm advisory services going down. There is a shortfall of human resources development. And that's what we need to focus on. The other short-term solution is to tax industrial farming, tax excess salt, sugar, and fat consumption. And this is consumption behavior change. It's not going to come through education. We have to tax it. And the other thing we require is better antitrust laws, just consider for a moment who's funding the COP27, who's funding the research, who's giving advertisements to newspapers. It's food and beverage companies. 10 companies control 90% of the organized trade. Agriculture commodities, 10 firms control 90% of the market share. Animal pharmaceuticals, 10 companies control 75% of the market share. Fertilizers, 10 companies, 28% market share. Agrochemicals, 5 companies, 84%. Seeds, 10 companies, 73%. These are the companies which advertise in newspapers, and the media makes people think in a particular way. They will not write against the companies because the advertisements dry up. Everything is connected. That's the food systems we are talking about. This is the food systems that is not being discussed. Consolidation of power in a few hands is something that COP27 should be discussing. It is something that the UN food system should have discussed. It's not on the table. We cannot set aside topics we don't want to discuss and pick and choose what we want to discuss. We criticize industrial farming. We use data of industrial farming, and we use that same data to criticize smallholder farmers keeping animals on the farm. We need to differentiate. And that's all I'm leaving this point to. We need to look at WTO subsidies. We need to look at subsidies in the developed world. Small number of farmers get large amount of subsidies, and that drives down cost, that drives down value of food on the table, which is unsustainable for small farmers in the global south. I mean, they cannot use sustainable practices because farmers in the developed world are getting subsidies which are so high in value per farmer. If you look at the data, you'll be surprised yourself. So short-term solutions is to do away with these subsidies in the West, which artificially drive down farm prices. Farmers get higher prices, farmers will adopt better practices, and definitely tax industrial farming. I absolutely agree with Jennifer, Simon, that we got to do away with industrial animal production. There's just no two questions about it. But do the political system have the guts to do it? Who's funding the political system? Let's look at it holistically, and maybe that requires a whole new session. And I hope 50 by 40 is going to do sessions on consolidation of power also. And the next time the question is not alternative proteins versus sovereignty of food, it's also about other issues that we're discussing here.
Thank you so much, Ajay. I guess it's the good old follow the money, right? Simone, did you want to come in and just very briefly, because we have to come back to wrap up in a second?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I'll quickly also do some remarks and respond to the questions. So I think the question how to scale up small-scale sustainable production, of course, the golden one. I think the argument, well, it's 90% of production is industrial, so we can't do it, is a bit strange there. Of course, the big question is that we have to work both ways. We have to reduce industrial agriculture, and we have to promote and scale up small-scale sustainable production. And there's very good examples here. In the Netherlands, there's an active discussion at the moment, political discussion about how to reduce livestock numbers with up to 50% in the country, which is partly forced by law, but actually the fact that we didn't comply with EU law, and now they will have to do this. And at the same time, for example, Austria has already 25% of its production organic. So there's, I think the percentage in some states in India is actually even much bigger. So there's already a broader shift happening, and the solutions are of course linked, because if we drastically reduce meat and dairy production, we can free up significant amounts of land for small-scale agroecological production by farmers making a decent living. And on the side, we probably have a lot of land, additional land being freed up for forest restoration, which is very needed as well. Messaging and counter marketing were mentioned. They are very much part of the solution to convince people they have to eat vegetables. Actually, there is a very active campaign by the Dutch government to promote more vegetable food consumption, which is pretty successful. Sadly, it's not yet combined with active messaging to discourage meat consumption, but that might come with the next government that's less influenced by the livestock industry. I just wanted to say to Jennifer, I do think urban backyard farming is definitely part of the solution. I happen to live nowadays in the middle of Amsterdam, and just around the corner of my life my house, they're establishing a food forest, a small one, but still. And we actually also have large and very popular complexes of so-called people's gardens, which is actually a system that already works for centuries in Russia, where there's millions of Russians living in apartment buildings, but who do have a dacha just out of town or around, in neighborhoods in their city. And it was actually this dacha system of having your own little garden that has helped a lot of Russians through food crisis and still helping them to cope with the current one. So I think this is just part of the solution, but it's an important one. The solution has many different sides. Eating more and more processed food is definitely not a solution, I believe. We do need to change the entire system and bring people closer to the food they produce, and also have them learn again what real food is, how nice beans can be. I just recommend you to read Tortilla Flat by John Steinbeck, where there's a very lively example of how people can live on beans only, and they're very, very healthy. And then lastly, AJ, first of all, you're very welcome in Amsterdam. This city has always benefited from immigration, so I definitely think it would enrich the city if a lot of you would come in here. But you are so right that we need to address the underlying problems, including the corporate capture of food and agriculture policymaking and the corporate capture of research, which is indeed astonishing. Of course, the UN Food System Summit was yet another example of this whole corporate takeover of the international debate on food systems that we need to challenge in all kinds of ways. And yeah, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and another, very bad example of how corporations have totally taken over the debate. We've all seen how the Coronivia debate was completely dominated by corporate interest or countries representing the corporate interests of their livestock industries. And we have to counter that all the time, because if not, we'll never get a real solution.
Can I just add really quick to Simone? I totally agree about the backyard farming. I was speaking specific to meat production.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. We're almost at the end. So in 30 seconds, I'm going to ask each of you to come in for 1 minute and 1 minute only, and just give some final remarks. And I already mentioned that I would be keen for you to talk about the next steps. What do you see as 1 or 2 key steps to improve the coexistence between agroecology, food sovereignty, and alternative protein, and keep bridging that gap? And within that, maybe also keeping in mind the differentiation between meat consumption in the global north and the global majority, and also thinking about the latest IPCC report made the clear link between overconsumption of meat in the global north and undernutrition in least developed countries. So I would like to Mariana, and I'm sorry I mispronounced your name earlier, like Mariana to go first, 1 minute. Then we're going to come to Ajay, then we're going to come to Jennifer, and then to Simone. Mariana.
My last thought is that it became clear that we have to combine solutions to actually make a difference in our food system. So I would say that we need more and more engagement from civil society and from multilateral agencies and from governments, academia, and also the private sector to improve research and development in alternative proteins. So we actually make real changes on our systems, and also drive even farther away from animal industrial agriculture. I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Over to Ajay.
So we tend to confuse identification of a problem with identification of a solution. I think so. These are completely 2 different things, and we should keep that in mind. The other thing I want to, in the last 30 seconds to say is that don't believe everything you hear at COP27. Don't believe everything you hear on the social media. Now, you will continue to hear something called Sustainable Development Goals. And as a farmer in the global south, I can clearly tell you not one of them is going to be met at 2030, not one of them. So why do we keep talking about setting objectives, working on those objectives, keep talking about achieving those objectives, and not one is met? And this happens because the people behind setting these objectives, the research, it's all fudge. You look at net zero, you think net zero is going to be achieved? There's no way net zero is going to be achieved. So these are things we need to understand. We give carbon credits. We are allowing people to pollute. We got to tax people who are polluting. We got to tax the fuel companies. You can't say that you can buy carbon credits and continue to do what you're doing. We need to change the narrative of the conversation that's happening. I just want to leave that thought with you. Change the narrative of the conversations for this world to change. Otherwise, we're not going to change. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ajay. Over to you, Jennifer.
I got to keep it short. Okay. I have 2 points. My first point is that it strikes me how this conversation is being threaded across thousands of miles through various different technologies that have been innovated on for decades. We live in a modernized world where technology is core to who we are. We are increasingly modernizing, urbanizing, and I believe that food should take advantage of innovation. There is no reason why we cannot change and innovate in the way that we eat. We do it with every other aspect of our life. We should do it with food too. The second point that I'm going to make is, who here opposes industrialized animal agriculture? Great, so we're all on the same page, okay? This is my call to arms to all of you. We all know what we don't want the food system to be. So let's not shoot ourselves in the foot and target the solutions and the moonshots that are trying to make something better. You may not believe that, you know, what I'm saying is going to solve everything, or perhaps what Ajay is saying is going to solve everything, but all of us out here are trying to do something better, and we need to stop infighting, because as you saw from every person in this room, we are on the same side. So let's stop attacking each other and walk out of this room and know we are in it together. That's the mindset we need to move forward with. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And over to you, Simone, for your final words.
I will keep it super short. We need system change, not climate change. And I do believe dietary change is very much part of food system change, especially in the global north. But please let us realize there is a global north in the south as well. I mean, I've lived years in Asunción, the capital of Paraguay, and there's definitely a global north there amongst the upper class and middle class consumers. Just like there's a global south in the north. It actually, figures came out that 1 of every 100 Dutch children is going to school in the morning without breakfast, and that is very much, you know, a result of the broken corporate-driven food system as well. So we need to change that food system all over the world.
Thank you so much, Simone. So we've identified a problem. We're all roughly on the same page. At least we know which way we want to go and where we want to end, how we get there, the theories of change, the ways we do things, and the obstacles we face in doing that might pose some issues that we need to iron out. But at least now we have the first of these conversations, and I think it's something we're going to continue to discuss much more going forward. So thank you so much to Mariana, Jennifer, Ajay, and Simone, and thanks to everybody who came here and to everybody who's been watching online. Thank you.